Now, without further ado, to open the government case, we'd like to invite Prime Minister to the podium.
Guys, let's have fun. Alright, so when we think on the opening government, you see that the law should be reflective and representative of the society. We also believe, especially when we're talking about a constitutional interpretation of how laws should be abided, we think that it's ever more important for the society's values to be reflected upon it. Therefore, we see a flaw in the status quo regarding how citizens' voices are not actually getting heard through legal interpretation, and hence we would like to present this policy. I, as the Prime Minister from the opening government, will provide you with, number one, contextualization of how this policy will play in our society, and secondly, about how this would uphold the very reason law exists in the beginning. Thirdly, we'll talk about how it solves the flaws in the status quo. My excellent speaker told me, as a good speaker should talk about the benefits of our policy. We tell you that the policy or the motion is as follows. We're going to contextualize controversial issues as issues that have impacts on people's lives that are being hotly debated in the society, such as things like gay marriage, such as abortion, such as gun control, and whatnot. We tell you that it's not really a matter of, in this debate, to talk about what is controversial or not. The fact of the matter is, it's something that people are heavily debating about, but nonetheless have no way to reflect those values or debates into how law is interpreted on its own. We tell you what we mean by popular referendum is mainly the model that we use for just ordinary policies. Like in the case of Korea, we actually had a popular referendum about whether we should provide free lunches for elementary school kids and middle school kids. We tell you that should a policy or should an interpretation of the law be up to vote, a yes or a no, that's simply how we're going to reflect those citizens' values. We think the model's simple and we think the debate should be more rich than the model itself. Furthermore, number one, we're going to talk about why the law is the way it is. Now we tell you that law needs to be reflective and representative of societal values, meaning the Constitution itself is systematically written in a very vague way because it's open for interpretation. We tell you that that's the very value of the Constitution, correct? And that we allow citizens to identify and relate to how they are governed and how their values, how the society's values are dictated on a daily basis. We tell you that in the status quo, it's not necessarily reflecting or representing the citizen's voice. Guess why? Because there's a flaw in the status quo, and this is where the opening governments want to contribute greatly. Now, we tell you that in the status quo, how law is interpreted, especially in the context of constitutionality, we say that right now we trust a group of people that, number one, that we don't even vote, that number two, presidents politicize in certain ways of actually being archaic people who have very set goals and very set agendas in interpreting the laws. We tell you that that system in itself is flawed. Why is it so? Now, it is so because number one, like I mentioned, that these people are not directly voted into the place that they're in. In other words, when we're talking about the Supreme Court of the United States, these people are actually delegated or elected by the presidents, depending on whether this person will vote yes or no on a particular issue. We see that it actually creates an arbitrary deadlock situation in which constitutional interpretations don't necessarily arise from a rich debate or rich discussion among these people sit down. Rather, it comes out of a very politicized environment where at the end of the day, the societal values are not reflected. No, thank you. We tell you furthermore that when we're talking about policymakers, right, or very politicians, mayors, and presidents, and whatnot, we do have a say in which policies will be governed by. We do have a say which direction our society will go to. And we think that's the beauty of democracy. But when it comes to our legal rights, or when it comes to how our Constitution is interpreted, we have no channels, we have no venues, but to trust the president to select somehow 9 fairly, rational people to decide upon us. We think that that delegation is simply wrong, especially when we're talking about issues that impact the very life choice that you may take, about who you're allowed to marry, about the choice a woman has over her body, and whatnot. We tell you, especially in the 21st century where the society is integrating and changing, and actually the debates are even hotter than ever through many media channels and whatnot, there needs to be a channel and a venue for the citizens to directly impact how they are governed and how they are held according to the values.
Ma'am.
But yes, ma'am.
Right, if you agree that that particular idea is controversial so much that to the extent it's a deadlock, then how do you expect the referendum to settle that controversy?
We tell you that the very fact of the matter is we don't the deadlock, the problem in the deadlock we see is that we have deadlock within 9 people that supposedly represents the entire society. We tell you that when we have a hot clash between the citizens themselves and one is a majority value, and that's how the Constitution is reflected, that's good enough. The problem we have is when we have 9 people deciding that for us. We see that's unjust and that's undemocratic. Sit down. Now, we say that there's a better way for our society to resolve controversies, right? We already do. We already have so many debates. We already have so many discussions. We already have so much clashes. But at the end of the day, if you can't directly intervene into how the Constitution is interpreted, how are your values ever as a citizen to be upheld? How are these issues ever to be discussed directly? Because again, we say the flaw in the system is that there's an elitist group that actually decides what is good for us and what is to be done within the society. Again, we would like to emphasize the politicization of this process, right? Because when we see the case of the United States, it's not rather, is this person willing to negotiate, is this person willing to be flexible about what the society wants, but rather let's have 4 Democrats and 5 Republicans, or let's have 4 people who are for abortion and 5 people who are against. In other words, the legal system itself and the value of law isn't upheld right now. Because the value of law is the fact that it's flexible, the fact that it's reflective of how people are differing in the way that they think. But if you already have 9 people that already know what they're going to vote for, already know what they're going to think, how is that ever interpreting the society that we live in? How is that ever achieving justice under the status quo? Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen, law's tough, right? This motion is tough. But at the end of the day, the choice you need to make is in a democratic society where there are many values to talk about, where there are many principles to debate about, how is a citizen, or how should a citizen, gain her way into allowing herself to be governed by the values that she deems correct, or that the society as a whole deems correct? We allow us to vote for our politicians. We allow us to vote for our representatives. How is it that the very constitutional representation of the values and principles and norms that govern me and my country not reflect my voice at all? We think a popular referendum about putting this law up to vote, of whether it's good or bad, whether it be majority or minority, is ultimately the way to uphold societal values, to uphold the beauty of the legal system in itself. And that is why we believe that OG will take this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the speech. Now I call the leader of opposition to the podium.
Before I move on to anything, let me clarify what this debate is about. This debate is about which side promotes the idea of democracy better, which side protects minority better. We think that is the main idea of constitution. That is the beauty of democracy. You protect minority as well as the majority. And I'm going to prove to you why the protection of minority, why adhering to the idea of democracy does not happen under their model. Before I move on to any of the principles or any of my arguments, let me rebut to their case. I have 3 rebuttals. First rebuttal is how they misrepresented the status quo that we have right now. They say that minority don't have any other ways to represent their ideas. Mr. Adjudicator, false, because we already have in a democracy that we have a system for people to reflect their ideas through voting, through public speaking, and whatnot. Secondly, if it's a problem of majority having the dominant power, so minority voices are not heard, I think this problem will not be solved by referendum, because the idea of referendum itself is majority votes, and majority gets to decide what there is. Again, we think it degrades the value of representation, because the system we have in the status quo is that you allow minority to represent their ideas. For instance, when you vote for something, you don't only vote for your president, but you also vote for the local level, you also vote for state level, you also vote for federal level. So even if you were a minority when you vote for your local senate, you can still be majority when you vote for the president. We think the system doesn't happen under the idea of referendum because they decided at once. So when you're a minority in that case, there is no chance for you to represent your idea. So we think the idea of representation does not happen under their model. Second rebuttal, value of constitution. They said the problem with constitution is that it's vague and it's open to debate. Yes, Mr. Adjudicator, that's exactly why that we need to have constitution. Because it's open to debate, because it's open to discussion, that is how we empower minority. Because people interpret it in a different way, in different circumstances, and we think that only on our model, that minority is better represented. Sorry, ma'am. Thirdly, about how elite group of people decide what is good for us and that is wrong. Mr. Adjudicator, if the problem is having deadlock on a controversial issue because 9 people already know what they're going to vote for, and if that 9 people is already the majority of the society, we think it's not going to change under their model because the idea of referendum itself is majority voting. Because if this 9 people represent majority opinion, we think it's not going to change under the model of referendum because when you vote for a referendum, it's the majority idea that's reflected. Let me move on to my argument. Yes, sir.
In the past, people used the Constitution as a shield to support slavery, to support people from discriminating against women. It was the people that forced to change that interpretation. So your interpretation that minorities will be affected is actually incorrect. Constitutions are the ones that use that against them.
Okay, they keep on saying that minority ideas are not represented. But again, that's a clear contradiction coming from their side because it's through empowerment, through getting their voices heard, that these ideas have changed. We think that doesn't happen at the referendum because it's only one chance where you get to voice your opinion. And if you're a minority, if you're a person who are for abortion, there is no change. There is no way for you to make change anymore. Let me move on to my argument. Firstly, about idea of representation. I have already told you that under the existing status quo, there is a way for you to represent your opinions. If you're a minority on the local level, you can still be the majority on the federal level or on the state level. So even if you're a minority, you have many different chances for you to reflect your idea. But when you just want one issue on a referendum, there is no chance whatsoever. Secondly, how their motion undermines the idea of accountability. What we see in the status quo is that you have the court system and you have the parliamentary system. And we want them to be equal because they look after each other and keep the check and balance system in the status quo. When you suddenly bring in the third party and say, oh, because the court may not decide on your behalf, because court doesn't reflect your minority opinion, now we bring in the population to vote for it. We think it directly goes against this idea of accountability because now you're clearly saying this court is incapable. Court is not enough to make a choice for minority. And we think that degrades the value of the court, and there's no more check and balance system, which we need in democracy. We need in democracy because they look after each other so that one doesn't empower the other. We think this idea of accountability doesn't happen under their model. Let me clearly tell you my argument about how minority is harmed. We think the idea of constitution and the idea of the democracy is not only to represent majority ideas, but also to represent minority ideas. And we think that is why constitution is for. Even if you're a minority when you voted for your president, constitution is there to keep minority rights. We think it doesn't happen. We think the minority harm is greater because now there's more incentive for these people who are elites, people who are with money, to make an issue more controversial because so they can influence the majority of the people and vote for it. We think it goes against the idea of protecting minority because minority don't have that much power, minority don't have that much money. Now it gives incentive for this few people with money and power to make an issue more controversial. More controversial, so if you move into the referendum and change the constitution. We think this creates ambiguity and also it vagues the value of the constitution, which is to protect minority. Sorry, sir. We think minority should not be excluded from the system. We think the rights and restrictions are already built in the constitution to protect this minority. Under their referendum, under their idea of creating referendum, because when you vote for referendum, if you're not minority, you have no more chance to present your opinion. And because the idea of constitution itself is already for protection of minority, and because you degrade the value of accountability, which we need in a democracy system, so one does not dominate the other, we are very proud to oppose this motion.
very eloquent speech. Now I call the Deputy Prime Minister to the podium.
Mr. Speaker, we believe opening opposition is out of the debate. The moment they said, okay, people are the third party, they're out because they ruined the balance of democracy. We believe the balance of democracy, the crux of democracy, is that people have a voice when it comes to rules that regard their lives and society. Meaning, when people vote for the parliament and hold accountability to them regarding the decisions that they make, is because we believe the power is onto the people's hands, that people are the accountable parties, that people are the ones that shape the society when it comes to democracy. We believe they're completely out of the debate for saying that law is somehow fair when people have no say whatsoever in it, right? But let me be a responsible Deputy Prime Minister and rebut on their arguments more closely and move on to our substantive points, which is the actual benefits that the current status quo, when we have this policy, is in fact increased or is developed, right? The benefits, okay? But before I do that, let me first move towards to their actual rebuttals, right? They told us firstly that minorities' voice is not heard, and we think that's pretty much all we heard, right? They told us that we believe. First of all, Mr. Speaker, that all citizens must have a voice. This debate is not only about whether we reach a good decision at the end of the day. We believe it's more about how that decision is reached and what happens after that decision. Whether controversy is better resolved under our model. So let me explain further. We think that first of all, when it comes to a law that impacts people's lives, that changes people's rights, that changes the perception towards an institution that already exists, such as the law of gay marriage, right? It impacts people's actual lives, the form of life that people can pursue after a law passes, right? Or the perception of society towards the institution of marriage. We think that matter, in fact, is closely related to people. So we think that simply saying 9 justices, oh, this is not important, is undemocratic, which they failed to understand and engage upon. Second, and more importantly, I think that it's especially fair when the minority's decision is not reached by the justices anyways. What do I mean by this? We think that they completely concede or assume that justices are somehow fair and all good people who look at the matters and who decide fairly. We think that that's not really the case. Why? My first speaker clearly explained to you, Mr. Speaker, that they're highly politicized. Right? That, for example, Justice Scalia sat down. Justice Scalia is notorious for having a conservative view on every single topic. That you do not reach a consensus, that you do not reach a discussion, that you do not reach a justification or resolution of a matter when it comes to these laws, when you have set number of people sit down, when you have set number of people who simply have their political motives or handpicked by a political party and government. We say that that's simply not minority decision to begin with. Why? Because these people have political motives to begin with when they vote for these. Sit down. When they vote for these people, we say that it never really changes. The view is never reflected, and we say that that's simply the burden that you have to prove and engage. Lastly, on the minorities issue again, I think that it's especially important when you want to uphold minority views. The society has to somehow agree that there has to be a proportional opposition. Meaning, when the United States Constitution stricken the slavery law, it took 100 years for the society to follow. And during that time, even if there was a clause, regardless of people's decision, that slavery is banned, blacks were still under the subjection of, lynching, subjection of not being able to vote because of other laws such as poll tax that were still subject to same level of discrimination that existed before. Why? Because the court simply overruled and imposed their views when the society simply had no chance of discussing on that issue. We said that that's exactly why opening government takes this debate home. Why? Because I'm going to explain to you from now on the benefits that solely exist under our model. Sit down. We tell you, okay, so when justice's decisions are unilaterally simply given to people, first of all, we say that there's really no incentive or reason for people to discuss on this matter and to persuade each other. I think that persuasion is the crucial part of referendum. Why is this so? Because in this case of referendum, in the case of simply justices deciding on an issue, people have no way or no reason to discuss their views or to persuade each other because their engagement on that matter is never interpreted or never forced upon to actuality. But in the case of referendum, the discussion and active persuasion happens more. Why? Because now the very discussion that happens becomes the reality at the end of the day. People have more reason to write journals about not journals, but newspaper journals about it. Media more deals with the both sides. People are more forced upon to reach a consensus, to be persuaded even more, especially when certain agendas are represented by political parties, such as how Democrats support for abortion, and how Republicans do not support for abortion. These parties actively try to persuade people to change their views. We think that discussion is a crucial part of referendum. When that discussion never even happens within the people, that there's more room for improvement, more room for agreement under our model. Secondly, more importantly, we think that there's more legitimacy to the laws that pass under our model. We think the issue is resolving the controversy, not simply reaching to a ruling. We think that when you want to resolve a controversy, your society has to agree there's certain legitimacy within that ruling. When people clearly know that political motives, that these justices simply have their set views and decided on them, they're more pushed in a way, they're more justified to go against that ruling, to go against and to declare that we can overrule that was unfair, that we still like having no abortion, that abortion is still illegal under our constitution. That creates more division because the opposition has the justification or legitimate justification to say that this is not the rule that we want. When you in fact have a referendum, you say that you people agree in a way more. Why? Because it's in fact the people who handpicked these decisions that they never had a say in the first place, right? We think that it shows certain examples of the Christian groups trying to lobby to the political groups so that the President Bush actually picks a new justice so that the abortion law gets overruled. We think that these kind of opting out from the existing ruling or to create further controversy disappears under our model. Why? Because referendums simply a legitimate ruling where people had a say, where the majority of the society agreed upon. So all in all, Mr. Speaker, what is democracy? Democracy is where we handpick the rules that impose to us, that it only happens under opening government. We're very happy to propose.
Now I call the Deputy Leader of Opposition to the podium.
When we were outside this room, before we entered this room, opening opposition and open government agreed that we would have fun debates, entertaining debates. I feel quite betrayed. And the second speaker started to come up here and says that we're simply out of the debate because we're trying to attack the case effectively. I think this is no fun anymore. And I'm going to address that in their mind. The stance coming from open opposition is clear. we're not trying to say that referendum is evil. We're not trying to say that referendum should be banned. What we're trying to say in this side of the house is that referendum should not be the first priority when it comes to decide public decisions, public policies, and whatnot. We think that referendum should be a last resort when it comes to deciding the most important ones. Once we try all the other things, and once majority of people think that, and once majority of people can agree that certain particular policy is wrong, that's when you try to turn over that policy, for instance, slavery by referendum. We think that's the context they want to talk about, but we're not trying to ban or say that referendum itself is evil. We're going to try to talk about, once you emphasize referendum over branches that we already have in the status quo, that's when you cause harm, that's when you undermine the minority in the status quo. For instance, let's talk about gay. When you say that, when the majority of people say that gays are faggots, gays are dirty, and gays deserve to die, and then they, for instance, and they say, and they make it into law by referendum, we think once you, even later on, when you decide to realize that maybe it's not, it's too late because public power's decision is such a strong thing that it becomes almost impossible to turn over that decision. We think the reason why slavery itself is meaningful in their context, because first of all, it was the courts that decided slavery was legitimate, and we agree that referendum had a power to turn that over. But we think that once you emphasize and prioritize referendum and make hasty decisions saying that gays are bad, later on when you realize that actually gays are not really bad, the court can't decide to turn that over because public's power, as they mentioned, is such a strong thing. That's why it's a ban. That's the context that we want to debate about, not saying that referendum is bad.
On that point, sir.
Sure.
When you see society, is it the courts that decide for the people that you are wrong, or is it the society that changes and forces the judges in the legal system to change according to the justice that society accepts?
No, there are arguments under the assumption that court is bad and court doesn't reflect you. We think that itself doesn't fall in terms of fair democracy, because we do have accountability, which our first speaker clearly told you. We do have check and balance system where parliaments can check the legitimate party and the courts that where they make laws and whatnot. We think that once you empower a third party to turn down the power of one of the three branches, that's when you break that check and balance system, and that's when it becomes harder. Secondly, they talked about how referendum increases debate and discussion. No, it doesn't, ladies and gentlemen. When you're simply making this an issue and make people vote whether plays are good or bad, they don't necessarily debate about it, they vote about it. And the problem is, it's simply yes and no decision. We told you that there's a clear distinction regarding minorities in terms of having political decision and having political elections. Why? Because there's different level of elections, like local elections and whatnot. So even if you are a minor local area, you still get to reflect your votes, and that vote becomes an issue in parliament. But under their context, minors simply have extremely low voices because you're talking about in a bigger level where there's everyone not necessarily powering the minorities in the first place. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things in this case. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why, particularly regarding controversial issue, it's a bad thing. Secondly, I'm also focused on the harms that their policy brings. So first, regarding why particularly controversial. Why particularly controversial issue. Firstly, you think that if you have a deadlock, you should be able to solve this by public debate. You should be able to do this by other forms of, by making people solve the deadlock. We don't think referendum necessarily solves it because it's just like in VP debate, when panels disagree and they debate about it and they come to conclusion. That is a good VP debate, but what we don't want as debaters is where panels simply vote about it and say, not necessarily have debates. We think that's what's going to happen under their model, because you're simply voting about it, not necessarily having a lot of information. Once you prioritize referendum, we think that's the context that we debate about. Secondly,
for information.
Sure.
So even in U.S. Supreme Court, when 9 judges cannot make consensus, they vote. Why is expansion of that mechanism still bad? The court does it.
We think what you're trying to say is, if you try to say that we tried everything and it didn't work, and therefore we're going to try referendum, it's become impossible hard for us to rebut to that, because as they said, they've tried everything. But the context in this debate is which one you prioritize, the court decision or public decision. You're trying to say that we should prioritize public decision, and we're trying to say it's bad. I clearly give you an example. What Unity's answer is, for instance, when you say that black people deserve to be less treated, and when you make it to referendum, and for instance, when white dominated society votes that they should be, how do you ever turn that decision over later on when you decide that it wasn't true? How does the court ever decide to turn that over? We think that's why referendum should be used as a last resort, not necessarily emphasizing it. Secondly, let's talk about the harms once you emphasize referendums. We think that it clearly told you, no, I had enough. It clearly told you that minors can have a say because they're why? Because firstly, we think that these less privileged people cannot compete fairly in terms of the voting decisions. Why? The ones with money, the ones with political power, the ones with more people decide to publicize this issue. The ones with more money decide to send more advertisements, persuading more other people, trying to make this a controversial issue. We think it's impossible for minors who can't even put an ad on television to simply. We can't expect them to simply win over the majority when they're throwing advertisements all over the TV. Secondly, we think that another extreme problem that I'd like to mention is that even if it's not necessarily a controversial issue, even if it's something that's already agreed, if majority don't like that decision, if the powerful politicians don't like the decision, you make it a controversial issue because you are the majority. You can say to your majority fellows that let's make this a controversial issue, despite the fact that we already have reasonable reason to believe that there's a conclusion. You make it into controversial issue, and you simply appeal it to referendum because that's what they're trying to do. In that context, it's extremely hard for minors to actually fairly compete. We think that's when you have problems. So what we told you in open opposition was clear. We're not trying to say that referendum is evil. We're trying to say that referendum should not be prioritized because the power of referendum, as we conceive, is such a great thing, such a powerful thing that when you simply emphasize and advocate that referendums in many cases, particularly regarding controversial issues, we think that's extremely hard to turn over. That's when you ruin democracy, ruin the accountability. For these reasons, we're very proud to post. Thank you.